The room was silent, except for the soft crackle of the fireplace and the sound of papers being shuffled. Then my daughter-in-law, Rebecca, stood up and said the words that froze me in place. Per Patrick's wishes, Marietta will not be receiving any remaining assets from the estate. I just sat there, unable to breathe. $52 million, the life my husband and I had built together, and I had been erased from it with a few sentences read in a calm, legal voice. I had cared for him when he couldn't walk, fed him when he couldn't hold a spoon. And now, his own daughter-in-law was cutting me out like I'd never existed. But when the lawyer suddenly laughed, quietly, under his breath, something shifted inside me. It was strange, almost as if Patrick himself had whispered from beyond the grave, saying, "Don't let this go." After the will reading, the house was empty again. The last guests drove away, leaving behind half-drunk cups, folding chairs, and the fading smell of lilies. Rebecca had arranged it all, the slideshow, the flowers, the catering, every detail perfect, too perfect. Patrick would have hated it. He always said funerals should be messy and human. People should cry, forget their umbrellas, and tell bad jokes. But this one felt choreographed, as if grief itself had been rehearsed. When I stepped back into the house, Rebecca was already packing up files at the dining table. I tried to speak, but she didn't even look at me. Her voice was mechanical. "We'll move forward with the legal processing next week. I've already arranged everything with the firm." No mention of me. No question about what I wanted. No acknowledgement that I'd spent 6 sleepless months beside his hospital bed while she was flying to conferences. Then she handed me a small box. "He wanted you to have this," she said. Inside was a single silver tie clip. That was it. No note. No message. Just silence. That night, I sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea gone cold. Every wall, every scent still carried Patrick's presence, his books, his aftershave, his laughter echoing faintly through memory. But I felt like a stranger in my own home. My name had been erased from every corner, from every piece of the life we'd built. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe grief was making me see things that weren't there. But something inside me whispered that this wasn't over. That there was something Rebecca didn't want me to find. And when the email arrived 2 days later, a cold, formal meeting request about estate administration, sent from Rebecca's assistant, not even from her, that whisper became a chill down my spine. That I didn't know it then, but that meeting would be the first step into a story my husband had tried to warn me about, one that could destroy everything he'd left behind. Rehook. Because when I walked into that boardroom, I didn't just find paperwork, I found the first crack in Rebecca's perfect mask. The meeting was scheduled for Wednesday at 9 a.m., in a high-rise downtown office that smelled faintly of eucalyptus and fresh ink. The email had called it routine estate processing, but everything about it felt off, impersonal, distant, like an appointment for someone else's life. I almost didn't go. Twice I turned the car around before forcing myself to keep driving. By the time I arrived, I was 5 minutes late. A young receptionist glanced at me as though I'd walked into the wrong building. She guided me through polished glass doors into a long conference room. The air was too cold, the kind of cold that doesn't just chill your skin, it settles in your bones. 7 people sat around the table, all in dark suits. Rebecca was at the head, posture perfect, eyes fixed on a neat stack of folders. She didn't greet me, didn't even look up. Just a small nod toward the far chair, the one furthest from the table's center. As executor of the estate, she began, her tone clipped, "I'll be reviewing the distribution as finalized in Patrick's will." Her words cut like paper, clean, sharp, detached. She spoke of stocks, properties, and trusts as if they were numbers on a spreadsheet, not the pieces of a life we'd built over 4 decades. I sat still, hands clasped tightly in my lap, listening as she read off every asset, 2 commercial buildings, investments, the winery shares, and then, silence. She flipped the last page, cleared her throat, and one of the associates asked softly, "And Mrs. Sloane's allocation?" Rebecca didn't even look at me. There are no remaining distributions assigned to her under the current filing, she said. The words echoed, hollow and heavy. No explanation. No emotion. Just erasure. A warmth crept up the back of my neck, but my hands stayed still. I didn't give her the satisfaction of reaction. The room fell quiet for a heartbeat too long before someone cleared their throat and moved on, pretending they hadn't just watched a life vanish from paper. When the meeting ended, Rebecca packed her briefcase slowly, carefully, as if waiting for me to protest. I didn't. I stood, adjusted my scarf, and walked out without a word. Downstairs, the city noise hit like a wave, cars, footsteps, the faint hum of traffic lights. I felt weightless, hollow. Not even angry yet, just erased. At home, I sat in the dark for hours. The silence felt heavier than grief. Patrick's cane was still by the door, exactly where he'd left it. I hadn't had the heart to move it. I told myself to let go, that money didn't matter, that maybe I was imagining things. But my instincts wouldn't quiet. Late that night, I opened the drawer in Patrick's study, the one that squeaked the same way it always had. Inside were envelopes, receipts, and at the back, a thin manila folder with no label. Inside were 3 pages written in Patrick's unmistakable handwriting. The first line made my heart stop cold. Didn't sleep that night. The words in Patrick's handwriting kept circling my mind like a clock that refused to stop ticking. His note wasn't long, just a few lines, written in his shaky script, but it carried the weight of everything I hadn't seen. He had been suspicious of Rebecca, and worse, he had stayed silent. I read the second page. It was a draft of the will, one I had never seen before. My name had been there once, written in black ink, then scratched out with a red pen. Beside it, in the margin, a note in someone else's handwriting, "Discuss with Rebecca." It was like watching my marriage being deleted one edit at a time. The third page was a typed list, legal appointments, most of them dated during Patrick's worst hospital days. He hadn't been strong enough to climb the stairs, let alone attend meetings. So who had gone in his place? I stared at those papers until sunrise, then hid the folder beneath a stack of old magazines in the hallway closet. I didn't know what to do yet, only that this was deliberate, not some clerical mix-up. Rebecca had planned something, and Patrick had sensed it, but never stopped it in time. By morning, I knew who to call. Daniel Crow, one of Patrick's closest friends and former business partners. Steady, rational, loyal. We hadn't spoken in years, not since Patrick's retirement. I found his number in an old address book and dialed. When he answered, his voice was cautious but kind. After I told him what I'd found, he fell silent for a long moment, then said simply, "Bring it to me." We met the next day at a small cafe off Elm Street, the kind with chipped mugs and soft jazz humming overhead. I slid the folder across the table. He opened it and read quietly, his eyes narrowing with every page. When he reached the handwritten note, his expression hardened. "This isn't an accident," he said finally. "It's calculated." He pulled out a notebook from his coat pocket and began scribbling names and dates. "These witness signatures, you recognize them?" he asked. I shook my head. None of them had ever been in our home. Patrick had always used close friends as witnesses, never strangers. "That's our first red flag," Daniel said. "If Rebecca handled the paperwork alone, there's more she's not telling anyone." We agreed to move carefully. No confrontation. Not yet. He would start by verifying the original will at the county office and comparing it with the one Rebecca had filed. Meanwhile, I would keep everything exactly as it was, untouched, unseen. That night, I sat in Patrick's study again. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the ceiling fan. I found his old planner, filled with pencil notes and reminders. On one page, a name caught my eye, circled twice, Hal Givens. I remembered him faintly. A tax consultant Patrick had known years ago. But why had Patrick met with him again while he was sick, and never told me? Re-hook. When I called Hal's office the next morning, I didn't know it yet, but his answer would unravel everything Rebecca had worked so hard to hide. Rebecca wants me to revise the will. Says it's for clarity, but something feels wrong. I haven't told Marietta yet. She'd ask questions I'm not ready to answer. My hands trembled as I reread those words. Patrick had doubted her, and he'd left proof. Re-hook. What I found next in that folder didn't just change the story, it proved Rebecca's perfection was built on something deeply corrupt. When I reached out to Hal Givens the next morning, I wasn't sure what to expect, maybe a polite brush-off, maybe nothing at all. But he remembered Patrick immediately. His voice softened as soon as I mentioned the name. Yes, he said. He came in a few months before he passed. Looked tired. Said he wanted to make sure his wife would be protected long-term. My throat tightened. And did he change anything? Hal hesitated. He seemed uncertain. Said Rebecca was handling the paperwork, that she had everything under control. I offered to do an independent review, just to be safe, but a week later, she called to cancel. Told me Patrick wouldn't need my services after all. I sat in silence, the phone pressed against my ear, my heart thudding. He promised to send me copies of his notes. They weren't legal proof, but they were evidence of doubt, the kind that could change everything. I called Daniel immediately. His tone sharpened as I explained. That's enough to start pulling records, he said. We'll need someone who specializes in this. That's how Lydia Velasquez entered the picture, a probate attorney with a reputation for uncovering things others missed. When we met her at Daniel's office, she was calm but direct, the kind of woman who could stare down a room full of lawyers and not blink once. She examined the folder, Hal's notes, and Rebecca's filings with quiet precision. Then she said, "These witness signatures, I've seen them before. They've come up in other cases. Unlicensed notaries for hire. Paid to validate signatures they never saw." My stomach dropped. Lydia didn't look up from the papers. "This wasn't sloppiness," she said. "It was engineered. We decided to move carefully. Lydia would file a motion to freeze all estate assets until the investigation was complete. It wasn't about revenge, it was about keeping Rebecca from moving or hiding what might still be traceable." The next few days felt longer than weeks. I spent them in near silence, my world reduced to paperwork, calls, and the hum of memory. Each night, I sat by Patrick's desk, trying to feel his presence in the quiet. I found an old draft of a document labeled Living Trust Addendum. It was unsigned, but the handwriting in the margins was unmistakably his. He had written my name beside notes like housing protection and health care provision. Then, beneath it, in smaller handwriting, Rebecca said she'll handle it. That was the moment my grief turned into certainty. Patrick hadn't abandoned me. He had been misled. I copied the document and brought it to Lydia the next morning. She read it twice, then said softly, "This changes everything." The motion to preserve the estate was approved 2 days later. Rebecca could no longer move a cent without court notice. For the first time since Patrick's death, I could breathe again, even if just for a moment. Then an envelope arrived in the mail. No return address. Inside was a glossy invitation, gold lettering, embossed seal. A tribute to Patrick Sloan, hosted by Rebecca. My name wasn't anywhere on it. Re-hook, I told myself I'd just go to watch, but by the end of that night, I realized Rebecca hadn't just stolen money. She had stolen Patrick's memory. The invitation looked expensive, thick paper, gold-embossed letters, every detail polished to perfection. It was exactly how Rebecca operated, precise, controlled, and soulless. The event was scheduled for Saturday night at the country club, a tribute to Patrick's legacy. I almost threw it away. But something inside me, call it instinct, or maybe defiance, told me to go. This wasn't about appearances. This was about presence. That evening, I dressed carefully. Navy slacks, a pale silk blouse Patrick had given me on our 35th anniversary, and a simple silver chain. Nothing dramatic, but intentional, a reminder of who I was before Rebecca began rewriting the story. The parking lot was full when I arrived. Inside, the air smelled of perfume and polished wood. The decor was elegant, sterile, white roses, gold linens, and a portrait of Patrick at the entrance. The same photo Rebecca had insisted on using for the obituary, the one where he looked tired and frail. She stood at the center of it all, perfectly poised, greeting guests with that delicate smile she'd mastered, the kind that never reached her eyes. When she spotted me, her face stiffened for a fraction of a second before regaining its composure. "Marietta," she said smoothly, "how lovely of you to come." I smiled faintly. "Wouldn't miss it," I replied. The evening moved like theater. Rebecca spoke about honoring Patrick's vision, while I drifted through the crowd, studying the displays labeled Patrick's favorite things. A signed baseball. A first edition novel. A fountain pen I'd gifted him years ago. None of them mentioned me, not even as the one who had chosen or bought them. It was as if I had never existed in his story. Then, a man approached me. I didn't recognize him at first. He introduced himself as one of Patrick's old business partners. "I assumed you were still managing the trust," he said casually. When I told him I wasn't, that Rebecca had taken full control months before Patrick's passing, confusion flickered across his face. "That's strange," he muttered. "Patrick told us you'd remain co-trustee." My heart sank. Another lie, hidden in plain sight. Later that evening, I overheard one of Patrick's colleagues mention an email Rebecca had sent before Patrick's death, discussing managing partner responsibilities and future transitions. She hadn't waited for him to die. She had already begun taking over while he was still alive. I left the club before the speeches ended, my heart heavy but my mind sharper than it had been in months. This wasn't grief anymore. This was war, quiet, deliberate, and overdue. The next morning, I met Daniel and Lydia and laid everything on the table: the overheard conversation, the inconsistencies, the emails, the missing acknowledgments. Lydia's eyes narrowed as she pieced it all together. "This isn't just unethical," she said. "It's coercion, and it's provable." Re-hook. Rebecca thought she'd buried the truth under signatures and smiles, but she was about to learn that ghosts don't stay silent forever. Well, weeks later, the first court date was set. Lydia called early that morning, her tone steady but urgent. "Rebecca's firm filed a response," she said. "They're accusing you of interfering with a lawful estate transfer." I almost laughed. After everything Rebecca had done, I was the one accused of interference. Lydia told me not to worry, that we had more than enough to counter her claims. Still, the accusation stung. By that evening, Lydia had filed our rebuttal, evidence of altered documents, inconsistent signatures, and the note Patrick had written before his death. But it wasn't enough to win, not yet. We needed a witness. That's when Daniel called. "One of Rebecca's assistants just reached out," he said. "She wants to talk." Her name was Ava Kendall, mid-30s, quiet, sharp-eyed. She arrived at Lydia's office 2 mornings later, nervous but determined. She had brought her planner, filled with notes and timestamps from her time working under Rebecca. Ava's hands trembled slightly as she began. "There was a night," she said, "a Sunday evening. Rebecca called me back to the office. She said it was urgent, Patrick's final signature was needed on an amendment. But when I arrived, Patrick wasn't there. The papers were unsigned. Rebecca told me to witness them anyway, said he'd signed earlier, just not in person." Lydia leaned forward. "And you signed?" Ava nodded, ashamed. "She said it was legal, just procedural." I didn't realize what I was part of until later. The next morning, the documents were marked as finalized. She slid a page from her planner across the table. 7:43 p.m. Witnessed signature for R. No P present. It was dated 2 days before Patrick's final hospitalization. Lydia's expression hardened. "That's forgery," she said quietly. "And it proves the will Rebecca filed was fraudulent." Ava swallowed hard. She told me to keep quiet, that it was in everyone's best interest to move things quickly before Patrick's condition worsened. I didn't question her. I just didn't want to lose my job. When Ava left, the room was silent. For the first time since this ordeal began, Daniel exhaled, a slow, steady breath of relief. "That's it," he said. "That's the crack we needed." Rebecca's empire of control was starting to crumble. And the best part? She didn't even know it yet. Re-hook, but when Rebecca finally learned we had a witness, her response wasn't panic. It was retaliation. The letter arrived 2 days later, typed and formal, wrapped in her attorney's polished tone. They accused me of emotional interference and vindictive litigation. They threatened to pursue damages if I didn't withdraw the case within 10 days. I read it 3 times, folded it neatly, and set it beside my coffee. Then I called Daniel. "Let her threaten," I said. "I've been quiet long enough." He laughed softly. "That's the Marietta I remember." By that afternoon, Lydia had filed our full countermotion. Attached were Ava's deposition, Patrick's original notes, and time-stamped security logs proving Patrick hadn't even entered Rebecca's office the day those signatures were supposedly made. When Lydia handed me the final document, she said, "Once this goes public, she won't be able to hide behind legal jargon anymore. It'll all unravel in the open." And she was right. Within a week, whispers started spreading across the board, quiet calls, concerned messages, hushed questions about Rebecca's ethics. The board of Patrick's Foundation delayed their upcoming vote, citing pending legal clarity. Still, Rebecca didn't back down. She scheduled a final executive meeting, sending formal invitations as if nothing had happened. I received mine on cream stationery, embossed with gold, a stage for her last performance. I went. When I entered that sleek conference room, every eye turned toward me. Rebecca was seated at the head, poised as ever. "Marietta," she said with a soft smile, "so glad you could join us." I didn't answer. I simply reached into my bag and slid an envelope across the table to one of Patrick's oldest friends, a man who had known him longer than Rebecca had been alive. Inside was Ava's signed statement, the falsified timestamp, and a copy of the original will with Rebecca's handwritten edits. He opened it, read silently, then passed it down the table. One by one, they all read. Rebecca's expression tightened. Her pen stilled. The silence was louder than any accusation. Finally, I stood. "Patrick built this foundation on trust and integrity," I said. "If those values no longer matter here, then none of this means anything." And then I left. Calmly. Without looking back. Later that evening, Lydia called. "The board has requested an independent audit," she said. "Rebecca's been suspended from all financial control until further notice." I didn't celebrate. I just sat on the porch with a cup of tea, feeling the air shift around me. For the first time in months, I didn't feel erased. I felt real. Re-hook, but Rebecca wasn't done yet, and before this story ended, I'd uncover one final secret that would rewrite everything I thought I knew about Patrick's last days. For a few blessed days, the world went quiet. No emails. No legal threats. No whispers of control. Rebecca's voice, once everywhere, had vanished. Lydia said silence like this usually meant one thing: someone was negotiating behind closed doors. But even in the calm, I couldn't rest. Something in me still felt unfinished, like a chapter half-read. That's when it happened. While cleaning Patrick's old study, the one I had avoided for months, I found a small envelope wedged behind his ledger. It was sealed but unmarked, the paper yellowed slightly at the edges. I recognized his handwriting instantly, the small, deliberate loops only he made. My heart raced as I slid my finger beneath the flap. Inside were 4 handwritten pages, folded neatly. At the top, he had written just 3 words, "For Marietta, always." His letter wasn't long, but it was everything I hadn't known I needed. He wrote about his fear, how he had felt pressure to make changes he didn't understand, how Rebecca had convinced him that I would be taken care of through other channels. "If you're reading this," he wrote, "it means something went wrong. But I want you to know this, I never meant to leave you behind. I trusted where I shouldn't have. Don't let my silence become your burden." He ended with a line that broke and healed me all at once: "You built everything I ever became. Protected as you always protected me." I sat there for hours, holding that letter against my chest, letting decades of love and grief collide in quiet forgiveness. For the first time since the Will reading, I felt clarity, not revenge, not rage, just truth. When I showed Lydia the next morning, she smiled softly. "This won't change the legal outcome," she said, "but it changes the story, it's proof of intent. We archived it formally, not as evidence, but as history, Patrick's own words, unedited and unfiltered." 3 days later, Lydia called again. Her tone carried something new: victory. "Rebecca's withdrawing from the foundation," she said. "No statement of guilt, but she's stepping down. She doesn't want the investigation made public." I didn't ask for details. I didn't need them. The truth had already done what it was meant to do, it had stripped away her power, word by word. That night, I walked through the garden Patrick and I had planted together years ago. The air was cool, the soil damp, and tiny green shoots were breaking through the dirt, the first promise of spring. I whispered, "I found your letter, my love." And for a moment, I swore I could feel him there, in the wind, in the earth, in the quiet that finally felt like peace. Re-hook, but one last surprise was waiting, a quiet echo of Patrick's legacy that would prove his story, and mine, were far from over. It was a gray morning when I returned to the foundation building, the first time since everything had fallen apart. The glass walls that once intimidated me now looked almost fragile in the pale light. Inside, the atmosphere had changed. No more polished arrogance, no trace of Rebecca's perfume or her sharp heels echoing across the marble floor. Instead, the board members greeted me with warm smiles, the kind that come from relief, not formality. One of them, an older man named George, handed me a folder. "We thought you'd want to see this," he said. Inside were the foundation's reinstated records, every note, every policy, every file corrected to reflect Patrick's original intent. My name was listed again beside his, right where it had always belonged, co-founder and trustee. My eyes blurred as I read the header. Not from sadness this time, but from peace. Later that week, the foundation held its annual luncheon. I hadn't planned to attend, but the new director insisted. "It wouldn't feel right without you here," she said. So I went. The ballroom looked just as it had years ago, sunlight spilling through tall windows, the sound of laughter, the clinking of glass. And yet, something felt different. The program no longer bore Rebecca's name. Instead, there was a single line under the mission statement: "In honor of those who stand for truth when silence would be easier." During the speeches, the new director, a young woman named Lee, looked toward my table. "There are people," she said, "who fight for legacies not with noise, but with patience and grace. We owe this moment to one of them, to Marietta Sloane." The applause that followed was gentle, sincere. I stood just long enough to nod, then sat again, heart full. After the event, I walked home alone. The streets were quiet, the sky fading to gold. I passed the old bookstore where Patrick used to browse every Sunday. In the window sat his favorite novel, the same edition I'd once given him. That night, I brewed tea, opened the back door, and let the cool evening air fill the kitchen. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like a shadow in someone else's story. I felt like the author again, steady, whole, and unafraid. Rebecca's schemes had erased my name from paper. But the truth had written it back where it belonged, not just in documents, but in memory. And as I looked out into the dark, I whispered the words that had carried me through it all: I was never gone. I was only waiting to be seen again. Weeks passed, and the silence that followed Rebecca's fall felt different this time. It wasn't heavy or tense, it was full. The kind of quiet that exists after a storm when the air is still damp, but you can finally breathe again. I no longer checked my phone every morning for court updates or lawyer messages. Lydia had wrapped everything up neatly. The motion to preserve the estate had transitioned into a full correction of records, and my co-trustee position was permanently restored under my name. But more than any legal document, it was the peace that mattered. I spent most mornings in the sunroom, Patrick's old blanket draped across my knees, a cup of tea cooling beside me. For the first time in years, I didn't need to rush anywhere. The house no longer felt haunted, just lived in. One afternoon, Lydia stopped by to drop off the final paperwork. "It's done," she said simply, placing a manila folder on the coffee table. "Every file has been updated. The case is officially closed." I nodded, my voice too thick to speak. She smiled and added softly, "You know, not many people would have fought as calmly as you did. You didn't just win, you restored something bigger than property. You restored truth." After she left, I sat for a long time staring at that folder. Then I placed it in Patrick's desk drawer, the same one where I'd found his hidden letter, and closed it gently. That evening, I walked through the garden. The daffodils we'd planted were blooming again, bright yellow heads bobbing in the breeze. For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to look back at what had been taken. I only felt gratitude for what had survived. I thought of Rebecca, how her silence must feel now, stripped of control. I didn't hate her anymore. Pity had replaced the anger. People like her lived off manipulation until truth left them with nothing to hold. The moonlight spilled across the yard, soft and silver. I whispered into the stillness, "It's done, Patrick. You can rest now." The wind moved gently through the trees, and for a fleeting second, I could have sworn I heard him laugh, the same quiet laugh he always had when I proved him wrong about something small. Rehook, but before I closed that chapter for good, one last message arrived, not from Rebecca, but from someone I never expected. It came on a Tuesday morning, a simple white envelope tucked between bills and catalogs. No return address. Inside was a handwritten note on old stationery I instantly recognized. It was from Ava, the assistant who had risked her job to tell the truth. "Mrs. Sloane," it began, "I wanted you to know I've left the firm. I've started over, small consulting work, nothing grand, but honest. What you did gave me the courage to walk away. Thank you for reminding me that silence helps no one." Tears stung my eyes as I read it. Her words were simple, but they carried the kind of weight that lingers long after the paper is folded. I placed her note beside Patrick's letter, two voices from different corners of the story, both reminding me that integrity doesn't vanish when people try to bury it. It endures quietly, like a seed waiting for spring. That afternoon, I walked to the community garden Patrick and I had helped fund years ago. Children were laughing near the benches, volunteers planting early blooms. The plaque we'd once unveiled still stood, weathered but strong. "In honor of those who plant for a future they may never see." I traced the engraved letters with my fingertips. For the first time, I understood what that meant. This wasn't just about inheritance or names on paper. It was about legacy, the kind that grows long after we're gone. As I turned to leave, a woman called my name. It was the new foundation director, Lee. She handed me a small box tied with ribbon. "Something we found in the archives," she said. It belonged to Patrick. Inside was a silver lapel pin, the shape of a small oak tree. Patrick's favorite symbol. He used to say, "The oak doesn't rush to grow. It just stands, roots deep, waiting out the storms." That night, I pinned it to my coat and stepped outside. The stars were scattered bright across the sky, the air crisp and quiet. I looked up and smiled. The story wasn't about loss anymore. It was about endurance, about finding strength in stillness and voice in truth. Patrick's laughter lived in the wind. His legacy lived in every page, every letter, every bloom that dared to grow again. And mine? It lived right beside his, not as an echo, but as a voice finally heard. Final rehook, outro, because in the end, it wasn't the money, the titles, or the estate that mattered. It was the truth, and the courage to reclaim it. Months passed like chapters closing on their own. No courtroom hearings. No signatures waiting in neat piles. No email signed, "Regards, Rebecca." Just life, quiet, ordinary, beautiful life. The foundation thrived under its new leadership. Scholarships were reinstated, community projects revived, and Patrick's name began appearing again, not in headlines or legal documents, but in the laughter of students who benefited from the work he'd started. I wasn't on the board anymore. I didn't need to be. My role had changed. I was no longer the silent wife behind a powerful man or the forgotten widow erased from a page. I was the keeper of memory, the guardian of truth. Lydia visited one afternoon, carrying a leather binder. "This is the official archive," she said. "Patrick's will, your letter, Ava's testimony, everything preserved properly. Not for litigation this time, but for history." I ran my fingers across the binder's spine and nodded. "For history," I repeated softly. When she left, I sat in the garden until the light began to fade. The air was cool, heavy with the scent of rain. I thought about how much had changed, and how much hadn't. Patrick's cane still stood by the door. His books still lined the hallway shelves. I hadn't moved them, not out of grief anymore, but out of respect. They were part of the story, too. That evening, I found myself at the old piano. My fingers hesitated on the keys. Patrick had always been the one to play, humming softly as I read beside him. The melody that came out was uneven at first, but soon it settled into something familiar, his favorite tune, slow and tender. And as I played, I realized something profound: grief isn't a wound to close. It's a doorway that stays open, quietly connecting the past to the present. For the first time in years, I didn't feel haunted by what had been lost. I felt surrounded by what remained: love, truth, and a legacy too rooted to ever be erased. The house didn't echo anymore. It breathed. Rehook, but life has a way of sending its own small miracles when you least expect them, and mine arrived in the form of a letter that carried Patrick's handwriting one last time. It arrived on a Sunday morning, tucked inside a plain brown envelope. No postmark, no return address, just my name written in Patrick's careful script. My breath caught. The ink looked aged, the paper soft, but it was undeniably his. Inside was a folded note and a photograph, one I'd never seen before. The photo showed Patrick standing beside a small oak sapling, his hand resting on its fragile trunk. On the back, in his handwriting, were 6 words: "Plant it when you're ready." The note was shorter still: "Marietta, I know you'll find this late. That's how life works. But when the world feels still again, plant the tree. Not for me, for what comes after." I sat there for a long time, tracing the words, feeling the warmth of his intention even years beyond his final breath. That afternoon, I went to the edge of our garden, the same spot where he had once planned to expand the flower beds, and dug a small hole in the soft spring earth. I placed the tiny oak seedling inside, pressing the soil around it gently. The wind moved softly through the air, and for the first time, I didn't feel alone. I felt watched over. Not by sorrow, but by continuity. Days later, I walked past it again, and the sapling had already stretched just slightly taller. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind me of something Patrick always said: legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what keeps growing when you're gone. The house was quiet when I returned, sunlight spilling through the curtains. I poured a cup of tea, placed Patrick's letter beside it, and looked out at the garden. The oak tree was there now, alive, defiant, and rooted in truth. And for the first time, I realized this story wasn't about being erased or reclaimed. It was about endurance. About learning that even after betrayal and loss, some loves, and some truths, will always find their way back into the light. I smiled and whispered, "We did it, Patrick." Outside, the wind answered, steady and sure, rustling through the leaves of the tree that would outlive us both. Final rehook, epilogue tone, because in the end, what we build with love never really ends, it simply waits for us to remember it. As the days turned into months, the oak tree in the garden grew taller, its young leaves unfurling like pages from a story I thought had ended. Each time I passed it, I felt something shift, as if the house, the air, even my heartbeat, had found a slower, truer rhythm. I began visiting the community center again, the one Patrick and I had helped build decades earlier. The plaque with our names had weathered in the rain, but the words still shone clear: for those who plant, not for recognition, but for hope. I started volunteering quietly, helping sort donations, reading to children, watering plants no one else remembered to. It wasn't grand or dramatic, but it was grounding. Every small act felt like an echo of Patrick's laughter, like he was reminding me that legacies aren't built in courts or boardrooms, they're built in kindness. Sometimes people would recognize my name. They'd smile softly and say, "You were Patrick Sloane's wife, weren't you?" I used to tense up when I heard that, or felt so final. But now, I'd just nod and smile. "Yes," I'd say. "I still am." In the evenings, I'd sit by the window and write. Not legal notes, not records, just stories. Memories of Patrick, of the years we spent traveling, of the nights we spent dreaming about what we'd leave behind. Writing them felt like exhaling after holding my breath for years. Every sentence reminded me that even in loss, there is authorship. I had once been written out of my own story, erased from a life I helped build. But by standing, speaking, and remembering, I had written myself back in, not as a survivor, but as a witness to truth. And now, every rustle of wind through that oak tree sounded like a page turning. Every sunrise over the garden felt like another chance to keep telling it. Rehook, because when the truth takes root, no storm, no lie, no erasure can ever uproot it again. Final cinematic outro, designed for narration or storytelling close. Sometimes I still dream of Patrick, not as the man fading in a hospital bed, but as he was when we first built this home. His sleeves rolled up, his eyes full of plans, his laugh echoing through the hallways. In the dream, he always says the same thing: "You kept your promise." And I always answer, "So did you." Because love, in its truest form, doesn't end with death or betrayal. It lingers, in handwritten notes, in the courage to speak when silence feels safer, in every act of rebuilding that begins with trembling hands and ends with steady ones. The oak tree stands taller now. Its roots run deep beneath the soil of everything we endured, the grief, the loss, the rediscovery of self. And each morning, as sunlight filters through its branches, I realize that I'm not living in the shadow of what was taken. I'm living in the light of what survived. That is the legacy we leave behind, not money, not control, but truth. And truth, once spoken, becomes impossible to bury. So if you ever find yourself erased, forgotten, or silenced, remember this: you are still the author of your story. Pick up the pen. Write it again. Because even after everything, I did. And in doing so, I found that the quietest victories, the ones no one sees, are the ones that echo the longest. Final closing line: outro rehook, and if you listen closely, you might just hear it too, the sound of a life rewritten, one truth at a time.